So look, no doubt you've come here today to learn all about the GS550M. I've got a very soft spot for this bike because I used to work one of these in the 80s, and it's a solid bike. A lot of people, they criticize the 550. Oh, it's not really a Katana, it's just a GS550 with some fancy bodywork on it. Now, that's sort of a fair criticism, but what I would say is that the original Katana was just really a GS1000 with a fancy load of livery on it anyway. Yeah, there were some upgrades to it, but there were upgrades to this bike as well, and I'll go through them as we go. So you had the full range. So just stepping back into history then, back in 1977, Suzuki came out with the GS550. And that came out because Honda, of course, had kicked off with their middleweight, the 550 and 750, which had taken the world by storm originally, wiping out the British bike industry. And then, of course, Kawasaki with their Z range, which obtained iconic status, with the Z1 range, which again was famous for the Mad Max. I've done a video on that, the Mad Max anniversary, which we had locally in our town of Clunes lately, and of course it's got a huge following worldwide, the Z1. Suzuki were kind of a little bit behind really, and so they were playing catch up, and nobody can deny that the GS range of bikes were pretty much direct copies of the Kawasaki Z range, except that the GS1000 actually handled better than the Z1. So they were, you know, like most things, it was copied and improved upon. Now, the GS550, apart from the aesthetic improvements, of course, it did have a couple of performance improvements there, and I'll run through them because I'm familiar with both bikes. So we start off with the front with a 19-inch front wheel. Look, this bike isn't a flickable bike. That large front wheel makes the bike want to go in a straight line. So it's quite a nice, easy bike to ride on the highway because it doesn't meander all over the place. Like if you had the later ones were the GS550, later on had a 16-inch front wheel, and you're always having to concentrate on where you were going with that bike because it wanted to just wander all over the highway. But this bike definitely wants to go in a straight line because that's a lot of centrifugal force spinning around. You've got twin discs on the front. The original GS, the first one, only had a single disc, and on the back you've got a single disc. And again, the original 550 had a drum brake. They upgraded that as they went along in 78 and 79, but this bike's got disc brakes all round. And as you can see, they're picked out in a rather fetching bright orange colour, which is also carried through on the tank decal and the seat. A striking bike. So when the Katana came out, aesthetically it was a showstopper. The performance upgrades were only slight, but there was nothing like this style of bike. And when they came out, they weren't actually very good sellers because it was kind of too much to take on for the kind of conservative market that was out there. But saying that, after a few months and a few started hitting the streets, they started to catch on, and then they became very popular. So much so that, as you know, Suzuki have relaunched the Katana name again with the new bikes, and again proving to be very popular. And one thing we need to talk about, of course, is performance. So, you know, for those of you who like that sort of thing, I'll put the spec sheet up the top here and then you can have a look at that. But I'll just give you my impression of the bike. Look, every bike that you ride has always got what I call a happy speed. You know when the bike's content, you're not thrashing it or you're not labouring the engine. And this bike is actually happy at around 110, 120. That's kind of where it wants to be. And then you find the rev counter is up there again, up around 6,000 to 7,000 revs. So you've got to be a little bit careful with it because it does want to, you know, take you over the speed limit. And that's why I put this little texter mark on there, because the speed limit here in Australia is 100 kilometres an hour, apart from the freeways where it's 110. But so, you know, you just got to be mindful of that. So if there's anyone out there who's never ridden an inline 4 Japanese bike, I highly recommend that you give it a go, because they're completely different, you know, the singles and the twins, the triples there. They deliver a turbine-like power, and this bike is so silky smooth, and similar to like every other midweight bike really, you do need to actually rev it you know, to make it pick its speed up a little bit. And again, you don't find there's any real big rush of power. It's all very smooth right the way through the rev range, and it just takes you up nicely. And this bike will go into the red no problem at all, and just to hold it there all day long. So yeah, so I tend to just run up around the kind of top of the rev range really most of the time. But yeah, if you really want to sort of make it go, you can drop a cog and rev it a bit higher. So telescopic forks on the front, of course. I've actually recently changed the forks and redone the fork seals on this bike. Again, I've got a video on how to do that. The tyres originally were tube tyres, and this bike's actually had a modification done on it that it's actually got tubeless tyres on it. Now, of course, we're moving on to the engine. We've got the inline 4 double overhead cam, absolutely bomb proof. If anything, over engineered. These engines will just take no end of abuse and just go on and on and on. The only thing you do have to watch is you need to keep an eye on the oil level, because they do burn a little bit of oil, and but as long as you're mindful of that, you just keep it topped up. Again, I've done a video you can look at on doing your oil changes and checking your oil. With this one, you've got a little window down the bottom which you can check it on. Performance upgrades, for those of you who don't know, the original GS actually had 22mm slide carburetors. The Katana, however, was fitted with 32mm CV carbs. Also on the side of here, it's fallen off. There was a little badge on there which said TSCC, which stands for Twin Swirl Combustion Chamber. And I believe it was developed by Westlake, and it was a modification to the combustion chamber configuration to just give you a more complete burn on the mixture. So again, those two modifications were actually what gave the Katana a slight increase of horsepower over the original GS550. The other thing, of course, which lent itself to the durability of this bike was that the GS 4-cylinder range had roller bearing cranks, which when Suzuki moved on to the GS500, they stopped doing that. They used plain bearings. It's an incredibly bulletproof bike. Moving along, you've got your nice little Katana symbol there with the Katana sword. And you can see I've got some aftermarket ear shocks on there just to soften the ride a little bit. Single disc on the back, as we say. And then just we've got your indicators and backlight. So that lens is the same as you get on the GS1000. But I think that pretty much covers this side of the bike. I'll turn the bike round for you and we'll have a look at the near side. So not so much to see on this side of the bike. Of course, we got the 4-into-1 exhaust going around the other side, which tends to leave this side of the bike a little bit bare. Originally, of course, they came with exhaust pipes on either side, but again, trying to get one of those 40 years on is a bit of a big ask. So you'll find that bikes of this era have mostly got aftermarket exhaust systems on. A few things on here which I didn't point out, which probably I should really, is that there are a few modifications to this bike which aren't standard. Actually, I was told on the GS550 650 Katana forum on Facebook, which is an excellent Facebook page, by the way, that somebody said that they didn't think my clocks were actually original either. So I'm not actually sure about that, but they're definitely Suzuki. So maybe someone can comment in the comment section there and put me straight on that, because I'm not really sure. What I do know is that the bars that I've got on here aren't standard. They're an upside down, what they call a clubman bar. And that was just to give me more of a kind of an upright kind of position, really. And that's just the position I like to ride in. So they're certainly not standard, and they're not mounted in the conventional way. The other thing, of course, I've got on here are end mirrors. The standard mirrors, of course, go in these female threads here. And I took them off and put on end mirrors, and I find that the end mirrors are actually really good. You wouldn't think so to look at them, but I find the rear view is better with the end mirrors than the OEM mirrors. Then the other main modification I've done to this bike is the headlight kind of fairing cowl sort of arrangement you got on there. I actually bought that off eBay and sprayed it silver. Anyway, have a look on eBay and there's lots of different choices and you'll probably find that. Just look for that shape if you're interested in giving yourself a little bit of wind protection when you're going down the road. I suppose while we're on the subject too of we've covered the strengths of this bike, but we haven't actually covered any of the weaknesses. And I only just remembered because I've just seen the charging port which I keep on. This is like a cigarette female lighter socket which I use to charge the battery up or charge my phone or camera. But one of the weaknesses with the GS range has always been the electrics. One of the jobs I had to do on this was actually replace the stator, which had stuffed up inside this casing here, so I whipped all that off. And the other things that can go on these, and I had trouble with my old GS550, was the regulator rectifiers can also play up on the GSs, so they're quite famous for that actually. We found the cure for that back in the 80s was to fit the Honda Super Dream 250 reg recs. They were really good, so that was a kind of a standard mod. But yeah, if your reg rec's on the way out, you've got things like boiling your battery and blowing bulbs all the time, or even not charging, depends what's wrong with it. Yeah, it's probably your reg rec or your stator. One thing you do have to say about the Katana was that it wasn't a light bike, particularly with the 22-litre tank. By the time you filled that up with fuel, and if you got someone on the back or some luggage on the back, it didn't take much at slow speed maybe you weren't ready to stop, to tip the bike and it would fall over. So you've got to be careful of the weight. Another thing which people struggle with a heavy bike like this is to get it up on the centre stand. And to be honest, it's not so much a strength thing, it's more of a technique. The technique, of course, is to put most of your weight on the ball of your foot and push down as you pull the bike up. I'll just nip this up onto the centre stand so we can have a better look at it. But again, as I say, you want to get a good foot in to start with, feel the balance, get both of those legs on the ground, and then just lift with this hand and push with your foot. And it comes up pretty easily, really, if you do that. As I say, it's technique more than anything else. The side stand's in a funny position actually, and it's quite awkward to get to because it's quite close to the foot peg. But again, it's one of those things that you get used to. Big heavy duty O-ring chain on this. The 550s were always chain drive, and the 650, the previous one, and the Katanas were shaft drive. Now I actually went from a 550 to a 650 when I was dispatch riding because, like a lot of the guys, they picked a shaft drive bike because you didn't have to get involved with maintaining the chain and adjusting it and everything. So I thought that would be a good idea. But I found that the 650 wasn't so nice to ride because A, it was a bit heavier and I'm not a big bloke, so there was that going against it. But more importantly, with a shaft drive, I found that in the wet, there was always a tendency for, if you were leant over and the road was a bit slippery, to open the throttle and the back end could snap out really easily. And I found that gave me a few frights when I owned it. So I got rid of it and went back to the 550. And I think the reason why the 550 is so much more forgiving is because it's got some rubber bushes behind the sprocket in the rear wheel hub there. And that actually just takes a little bit of that snap out of the drive. And it just makes it a safer bike to ride, I find. So I don't mind having to adjust the chain occasionally, just for the sake of the added safety of not having the back end step out when you're in the wet. On this side of the bike, if I get the key, it's got the ignition key, and you got your fuel for your cap on top like that. And the key for the fuel does the seat lock to remove the seat. And it also does the helmet locks, which as you can see have got two hooks separate to hang your D-rings of your helmet on and lock your helmet that way. I'll grab the camera and we can have a little look and you can see what's in here. Not much to see under the seat really. You've got a bit of a space, you've got your air intake and your side panels which just pop off on these little rubber things. You've got to be careful with these prongs that you don't snap them off. That one there's been snapped off already and glued back on, you can see. But underneath there, on this side, you've got your battery, and on the other side, you've got your various kind of fuses And you got your solenoid as well, which is here for your starter motor, all your electrics, and your master cylinder for your back brake. I've also got really good beeper indicator unit on there, really good for making sure you don't leave your indicator on, and also good to stop pedestrians stepping out in front of you in the town when they're trying to cross the road so they can hear you coming. So we'll pop those panels back on carefully. I like to put a little bit of silicone grease on the end of these little probes, and then you find that they slip in and out of the rubber a lot easier and are much less likely to break. We'll put the seat back on. And then of course we got the handlebar arrangement here. Not much to report really, just your usual on off. You got your park and your steering lock built into the ignition. And you got your usual warning lights, neutral, oil light, high beam. If you got your normal lights on there, there's your high beam. And then you got this weird sort of toggle switch on the side which does everything: dip, high beam, left, right, horn, flash, just the usual sort of stuff really. Kill switch on the right hand side, run and off, and then you've got your main light switch, pilot light in the middle, or side lights, whatever you want to call them. And then you can actually turn the lights off, which is nice if you don't want your lights on when you're trying to start the bike on a cold morning. The other nice thing about this, the GS range actually, or all the way across the range, is the gear indicator where you got your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 to indicate 6-speed box. And it's not a bad little gearbox. I do find that neutral can be sometimes quite difficult to locate, but like most bikes you just get used to it after a bit. Alright folks, we better wrap this up because the wind is picking up off the lake at this time of day. Not much left to see anyway. Of course I've got a heavy duty O-ring chain on this bike. We've got our funny little Suzuki fuel tap mechanism where you've got your on and you've got your reserve. And the thing that people struggle to understand is you haven't got off, but you've got a prime function as well. The prime function is only used for filling the carburetors with fuel. You might want to do that in the morning if the bike's been stood for a little while, but usually you just leave it in the on position or the reserve position depending on how much fuel you've got. The idea of that is a safety thing, which if the bike fell over, you'd be in on or reserve, and the bike engine would stop, the vacuum would stop the fuel flowing through the bike, and you're not going to have fuel flowing out all over the floor. So it's just a safety thing. What I will say about these 4-cylinder engines is they're not overly juicy, but they're not the most economical engine in the world. I'll probably get about 40 to 50 miles per gallon out of this bike, and with a tank of 22 litre capacity, that probably gives me around 350 kilometers at the most to a tank full. Got your fold up foot pegs and your passenger pegs on the back. And with regard to the passenger, you can see that the seat is quite stepped on the Katana, and you do tend to find that the passenger sits a way bit higher than the actual rider. So again, it's not really, I'd call a touring bike. And it was originally designed as kind of a very sporty sport tourer in its day. There you go folks, that's my review on the GS550 Katana. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and if you have, feel free to smash all the buttons, and hopefully I'll catch you on the next one.